It's important to note that this is not just an ocean problem, of course. This is plastic pollution occurs on land, in soils, in freshwater, and in ecosystems spanning the earth. But to give you a sense of how I am going to answer this question, you can just take a look at this comic here. Well, I am actually going to begin with a broader perspective, and this comes from the study led by Roland Geyer at UC Santa Barbara that Martin mentioned at the beginning, that was modeling the production and fate of all plastics since the beginning of commercial production in 1950. So what you're seeing here is a plot showing plastics production in the blue curve in units of million metric tons as a function of year from 1950 through 2016 or so. And what you see is that there is a very, very rapid rise of global plastics production once this went into commercial production, and almost exponential. There's a little dip here around the global recession. But if you add up the amount of plastics produced globally over this time period, that adds up to 8.3 billion metric tons. So the growth in plastics production has outpaced that of all other bulk materials, steel, aluminum, cement, for example, and the production has nearly doubled since the year 2000. Well, 8.3 billion metric tons is such a tremendously huge number that I can't give it to you in terms of elephants or sports stadiums, but it's a big number. The other curve on here is this red line, which is showing global plastic waste generation over that same time period. And what you notice is that the curve has essentially the same shape as the blue production curve above it, but it does sit a little bit lower. And the reason for that is that, of course, plastics go into such a wide variety of items that we use, and some of those are used for quite a long period of time as durable goods. Whereas the bulk of the plastics we make are disposed of, they're thrown away, they become waste in the same year that they were produced. So things like packaging, for example. So there is a slight offset to account for that durable goods use. Well, in that study, we also estimated what happens to all of that plastic waste. And what we found was that only 12% of plastic waste that has been generated over this time period has been incinerated. Only 9% has been recycled. And that means that the vast majority is still sitting in landfills or the environment. And when you put that amount of waste together with the plastics still in use, it means that 90% of this 8.3 billion metric tons is still in existence somewhere on the planet. Well, I want to put this into the environmental perspective. So if we look at this curve, the first evidence of plastics contamination in the oceans, in the marine environment, was actually in 1966, when Kenyon and Cridler documented, this is a seabird carcass that has plastic bottle caps and other debris inside of its stomach. So this seabird had ingested plastic and presumably suffered from that back when global plastic production was only 5% of current production levels. The first document of microplastics in the oceans was in the early 1970s in the North Atlantic and in the North Pacific Ocean. And larger debris was also documented floating in the North Pacific. And that was just when production levels were 10% of those today. My organization, Sea Education Association, started researching floating microplastics in the Atlantic Ocean in the early 1980s, and Jude Wilbur published our data for the first time in 1987. So my organization has been thinking about this problem for a long time. But it wasn't until 2003 when Charles Moore, who's an avid sailor and environmentalist, wrote an article in Natural History magazine describing his view of the North Pacific Ocean from the deck of his sailboat. And he described, quote, "as far as the eye could see, the site of plastic," end quote. And in fact, it was in this article that the term garbage patch was born. So although plastics production has always been on this steep growth trajectory and scientists had been documenting contamination in the oceans for decades, no one was talking very much about plastics in the ocean or plastic pollution until the garbage patch was born. And in fact, the garbage patch is what made me interested in this topic as well. Soon after its description in Natural History magazine, the garbage patch developed into kind of its own phenomenon. So you heard things like twice the size of Texas or 3 times the size of France, that there's more plastic than plankton, that this was a floating island visible from space. And these are very striking and immensely memorable images and portrayals, but in fact, there is no floating island visible from space. Well, how do I know that? I know that because the scientists and students at SEA, at Sea Education Association, had been sailing in these areas, as I said, for decades. And this is an example of what one would observe from the deck of a ship in either the garbage patch of the North Atlantic or the North Pacific. So on a nice calm day, you would just see water, clouds, maybe you're lucky enough to see some dolphins or albatross or flying fish. But you will see floating debris items drifting by, and they could be as frequently as 1 item per minute. So they're typically singular items. There's not some large mass. And sometimes these are identifiable. So this is a boot drifting upside down, a 5-gallon bucket. You see a tire. There's a collection of items, a pen, an egg container, some food packaging. So you can see some identifiable items, but more often than not, you will see fragments or chunks or parts of things that, you know, its origin is not very obvious. Now, many of these photos of things that you can identify, especially up here in the tire, are from a 2012 expedition that we took in the eastern North Pacific, in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, about 18 months after the Japanese earthquake and tsunami that delivered millions of tons of debris into the ocean on the other side of the Pacific. So some of these household items we know were likely originated from that tsunami. Well, to an open ocean sailor who's used to sailing far from land, seeing these items hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from land is at first surprising and even a little bit thrilling. Like, oh my gosh, what is that tea kettle or tire or children's toy or unmanned kayak doing out here? And then it's shocking, and then it's ultimately distressing because, of course, I think we all agree, trash does not belong in the middle of the ocean. And yes, much of this is waste. But the picture changes when you measure what's floating at the sea surface by towing a plankton net through the water for just 30 minutes and sifting through its contents, which thousands of our undergraduate students have done twice a day, every day for decades on board our sailing research vessels. So those students come to Woods Hole in a sea semester program, which is a single term they take away from their home campus. Students come to us from all over the US and abroad pre-COVID. And they study for 6 weeks on our campus in preparation to become full crew members on board these sailing research vessels. So we sail, they stand watches and navigate the ship and raise and lower sails and work in the engine room and work in the galley. But they also stand watch in the lab where we deploy equipment like this plankton net that I've shown you to collect data to support the student research projects. So what does it look like when you tow this net, which is just 1 meter wide and 1/2 meter tall, for 30 minutes? Well, when you sift through the contents of the net, you see microplastics. And this is a particularly large sample of microplastics. So what you can see is that many of these particles are readily distinguishable from organic matter by their bright colors and their irregular shapes and their very hard texture, typically. And it turns out that the human eye and the human brain does a very good job identifying plastics, even without a microscope, at the size collected in our plankton nets. So these particles are typically larger than about 1/2 millimeter in size. Well, where did these come from? Are these a consequence of our waste? So some microplastics are manufactured in this size, things like cosmetic microbeads used in wash-off cosmetics, or the raw material of plastics production, which are industrial resin pellets. But most of what you're seeing in this sample are particles formed from fragmentation of larger objects. So plastics, when they are exposed to UV radiation and sunlight, become weakened, and then physical shear and strain forces in the ocean or on land cause these plastics to break into smaller and smaller fragments. So when we look at an individual particle, we can't determine their origin. And I mean that we can't tell where it came from geographically, but we also can't tell in most cases the type of object that it originated from. So we can identify the type of plastic by its chemical footprint. And that's how I know that the human eye can identify these as plastics, is because after collecting them, we've brought them back into the lab and used some chemical identification techniques. But you still can't tell, for example, if there's a piece of polyethylene in here, whether it came from a detergent bottle versus a milk crate, or if polystyrene foam came from a buoy versus a cup. Well, there are other types of microplastics that are shed during use, and you're not seeing those in this photo because they are smaller than our nets will capture. And those are things like textile fibers that get shed off of our clothing or other materials, and tire wear particles from our vehicles. Well, microplastics, would argue are the most numerically abundant and the most widespread type of plastic debris found in the ocean and beyond. Of course, they're not just in the ocean or not just in the marine environment. They've also been documented now in freshwater, including lakes and streams and rivers, in the terrestrial environment, including agricultural soils and other soils. Microplastics, especially those small fibers and very fine particles, have been found in the air. They've been found in snow, in drinking water, in bottled water, in wastewater, in stormwater. It seems that the smaller the particle, the more abundant and widespread they are, especially those microfibers, perhaps because they can be readily transported not only in water, but also in the air. So are these microplastics a consequence of our waste? Well, certainly they are. In fact, in our surface samples that we collect on the ocean surface in the quote unquote garbage patches, we find that most of the material we collect is made of polyethylene and polypropylene. And those are materials that are mainly used in packaging or single-use items. So yes, they are a consequence of our waste, but not entirely. Those plastic resin pellets do leak into the environment. That's a consequence of plastic production and transport. And also, as I mentioned, some of these particles are a consequence of use. Things like little bits of fishing line that you see in here. That's what these little thin things are. And textiles and tires, as I mentioned. Okay, it's important to note, we talk a lot about microplastics, but really debris, marine debris or pollution in the environment in general is not just microplastics. And so this is just a reminder that we're not just talking about microplastic, and we're not just talking about floating in the middle of the ocean. So if you've spent time on the coast, you've surely encountered trash on the beach, and hopefully it didn't look as bad as this beach in Peru, which looks to me like it might be an open dumping site, so certainly waste. Or this beach in Hong Kong, which looks like it's really the receiver of a lot of debris, especially perhaps fishing debris washing ashore. But if you go on almost any beach, you are likely to find some very common items. So the Ocean Conservancy has been conducting the International Coastal Cleanup for more than 30 years. Where up to 1 million people around the world do beach cleanup in September. And they've been keeping track of the items they've collected over time. And those items really haven't changed, and they're all very familiar to us. So things like cigarette butts and food wrappers, bottles and bags, cups and plates. So in fact, in 2017, that was the first time that all items on the top 10 list were made of plastic. And that's because glass bottles, aluminum cans, and paper bags fell off the list. They were not as abundant as the plastic items. And in 2019, this was the first year that cigarette butts lost the #1 spot. They were beat out by food wrappers. So as you look at these items on the list, these items are clearly waste. Well, marine debris is also on the seabed. This is a series of images stitched together from the seafloor in the harbor at Newport Harbor, Rhode Island, which is an affluent community that has a lot of recreational boating and sailing. You can see trash sitting down here. There are bottles and cups and cans. But the marine debris on the seafloor doesn't have to just be sort of household waste. This is a fishing net that was lost and got entangled in the reefs of Midway Atoll. And marine debris is also in deep and remote places. So here you see a fairly pristine looking plastic bag that was found more at 2,500 meters depth in Fram Strait in the Arctic. So again, waste. Well, I want to talk about sources of plastic debris to the ocean, because when we're talking about waste, we're really talking about one of the major sources. So what I'm showing here is just a flow diagram, a schematic, if you will, that was put together by a working group at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And we tried to brainstorm all the pathways of plastic to the ocean. So this is a little bit outdated. We do have more information now, but I think it's still a useful place to start. So at the top we have resin, and we're talking about the plastic material itself, which, as I mentioned, is frequently or typically formed into these pellets. So these are pretty small pellets, 5 millimeters or smaller. And those pellets get formed into plastic products. And those plastic products are either in use or they can be discarded. When they're discarded or thrown away, they could go into a proper waste management system and be properly managed, or they may not be properly managed and disposed of into the environment, for example. So improperly managed waste, we're thinking about littering or illegal dumping or open dumping in places that don't have robust waste management infrastructure. So when we go down to the properly managed waste, we do have a category, and that is wastewater discharge, where items are used as intended and they result in particles ending up in the wastewater treatment systems, which again are proper infrastructure, but some of the fibers from clothing that go through washing machines or those cosmetic microbeads that may still exist in some products get washed down the drain, go into the wastewater treatment plants, and some portion of those may escape and end up in the effluent that goes into the environment. I forgot to mention that the shading on the bottom here indicates whether we think the source occurs on land, at sea, or both. So that wastewater discharge is red because that's a land source, but improperly managed waste could be occurring, of course, at sea as well. Well, then we go down to the in-use categories, so plastics that are in use and ending up in the environment. So one example is fishing and aquaculture gear. So this is just an image showing some lost nets, but we can also think about lobster pots or crab pots, fishing line, or things that used in the aquaculture industry. Of course, shipping is one source of plastic to the ocean. If we have these large shipping containers that transport our goods all over the world, if they're in bad weather or run aground, some of these can end up in the ocean unintentionally. And then catastrophic events is also a source in that a tremendous amount of debris of all types, not just plastic, ends up in the environment and often the ocean in a single event. And there are some other sources down here that I won't discuss, but, and probably others. I mean, you really could think of an almost infinite number of ways for plastic to end up in the ocean. But these, we think, are probably some of the major sources. And the goal of this work was to try to put numbers in each of these boxes to understand what the potential largest sources of plastics to the ocean are, and therefore how to design interventions to prevent that leakage. Well, it turns out that as of today, we really only have one sort of scientifically published estimate for any of these on the bottom, I think. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong on that. And that's for improperly managed waste. And really, we're only talking about the red, the land sources. So I just want to talk through a study that was now published 5 years ago, but it was the first estimate of plastic waste, specifically entering the ocean from land. And this was out of that NC's working group led by my colleague, Jenna Jambeck. So how on earth do you go about estimating the amount of plastic waste entering the ocean from land? Well, we didn't start from measurements of anything entering the ocean. We started with estimates of waste production and waste treatment. So we started, our data originated from the World Bank, who compiled data for countries around the world on waste. The report was called What a Waste. And we started by estimating how much trash was produced per person per day in 192 countries around the world with coastlines. So the global sum of trash produced in the year of the study, which was 2010, was 2.5 billion metric tons. We estimated how much of that waste was plastic. That's about 11% on average. And that gave us this number here of total plastic waste, 275 million metric tons. Well, as a gut check, we looked to see how much plastic had been produced in that same year. This is before the Geyer study was published. That number was 270 million metric tons. So close, pretty darn close, actually. That told us that we're not way off in this estimate. Then we asked how much of this plastic waste was generated by populations living within 50 kilometers of a coastline, figuring that the majority of the waste would likely be generated close to the coast that ended up in the ocean. Of course, that doesn't account for rivers that go far inland or watersheds. But for the first pass, coastal plastic waste was 100 million metric tons. And then looking at waste treatment in those countries and applying a model, because there were very sparse data, we asked how much of that was not properly captured and contained or mismanaged. That was 32 million metric tons. And then we had to sort of say, well, what's the range of plausible estimates of how much of this 32 million metric tons entered the ocean? And the midpoint that you hear about a lot of our range of estimates was 8 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean in a single year in 2010. So this is equivalent to one New York City garbage truck filled with plastic waste dumped into the ocean every minute of every day for a single year. Or if you want to think about this in an ocean context, the lower range of our estimate was about 5 million metric tons, and that's equivalent to the amount of tuna that are fished from the ocean in a single year. Well, this study was done geographically because the data from the World Bank were sourced that way. And we published this map looking at the top potentially emitting countries based on that mismanaged waste calculation. And we found, you can see the darkest values here, the top emitting countries were all in South and Southeast Asia. That's due primarily to rapidly growing economies and associated increased waste generation without the capacity to manage the increasing amount of waste. So consequently, this region became the focus of many very important and urgent remediation efforts to help build that waste management infrastructure. However, an often overlooked result of the earlier work was that the United States ranked number 20 out of 192 countries in its contributions of plastic waste to the ocean. And coastal European countries, if you added them together, collectively ranked 18 on the list. So despite having highly developed waste management infrastructure and accessible waste management infrastructure, the United States was a top contributor because of its large coastal population and very high plastic waste generation rates. In 2010, in this analysis, the very large amounts of mismanaged waste in the US were solely a consequence of littering, which we estimated very crudely as 2% of plastic waste generation. Well, one of the limitations of this JAMBEC study was the very sparse data available for many countries around the world, as well as a lack of standardized measurement and reporting protocols. So even where data were available, activities such as illegal dumping and the international trade of plastic waste were not accounted for. Well, with that in mind, we undertook a closer look at the United States contribution of plastic waste, which was just published a few weeks ago in Science Advances. So I'm just going to talk through that study before wrapping up. So the goal of this study was to provide a refined estimate of the leakage of plastic waste that was generated in the United States to the environment globally. So as a first step, we used newly available data in the US to refine the estimate of the amount of plastic waste generated in the country in the year 2016. And that data came from waste disposal data from about 9,000 municipal solid waste management facilities across the country that was provided in an analysis by the Environmental Research and Educational Foundation, or EREF. And they found that the municipal solid waste generation was 37% higher than previous estimates by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And that result was consistent with an independent study done on the quantity of waste in landfills specifically across the country by scientists at Yale University. So using these refined waste generation rates, we estimated that the United States population generated 42 million metric tons of plastic waste in 2016. And that was the highest of any country in the world. It's also worth noting, though, that even using the US EPA estimates, which were about a third lower, the US still ranked number 1 in terms of the most plastic waste generated. Well, then we asked what happened to that waste. So in 2016, 9.3% of US plastic waste was collected for recycling, often in single stream recycling programs where plastic materials with recycling or resin codes number 1 through 6 are mixed together with glass, aluminum, and paper. Well, if you're familiar with single stream recycling and how this material is handled, you know that the collected material has to then be separated again, both mechanically and manually. And it's typically compressed into bales like these for transport to reprocessing facilities. Now, if you live in a community with single stream recycling, you're probably aware of the problem of contamination, and that's contamination by dirty items. So thinking of the not quite empty food jar, but also by items that are not recyclable. So sometimes very well-meaning people put an item in the blue bin in the spirit of wish cycling in hopes that it gets recycled. But in fact, the contamination of both kinds increases the cost of sorting and lowers the value of these compressed bales sold to reprocessors. Well, we looked at what happened to these bales, and for many years, the United States has exported plastics collected for recycling, or plastic scrap, to countries around the world for reprocessing. So using data from the United Nations Comtrade database, we determined that 51% of US plastic scrap was exported to 89 trade partners. And in fact, using updated information on waste treatment practices from the World Bank, along the lines of that JAMBEC study, we determined that 89% of that material was exported to countries with more than 20% inadequately managed waste. That is, the US exported our plastic waste to countries that struggled to manage their own domestic waste. And the vast majority of plastic scrap was exported to China and Hong Kong. Well, in addition to plastics, the United States also exported even larger quantities of paper scrap for recycling. And paper scrap is often contaminated by thin plastic film and flattened plastic containers. And you can see an example here of a water bottle flattened to this paper bale. both of which are light enough to be included with paper in the mechanical separation and are contaminants. Well, in 2016, 89% of our paper scrap exports were also to countries with greater than 20% inadequately managed waste. So using data from studies on the composition of both these plastic and paper scrap bales, we conservatively estimated the amount of contamination that was likely to be discarded during processing abroad. And then we estimated that in those countries with high proportions of inadequately managed waste, that between 25 and 75% of this discarded material was likely disposed into the environment by open dumping and open burning. So when we add that up, it means that the estimated amount of plastic waste collected in the US for recycling that was then exported and then entered the environment during processing is up to 1 million metric tons. Well, finally, we wanted to ask also how much plastic waste is entering the environment within the United States. So we, for the first time, made an estimate of the amount of plastic waste that is illegally dumped. And then we added on that littering estimate the same way that we did it in 2015. So within the United States, we dumped up to around 1 million metric tons of plastic waste into the environment within our own country. And when you put that together with the amount exported and mismanaged in importing countries, that comes out to 1.3 to 2.24 million metric tons of plastic waste generated in the US ending up in the environment somewhere in the globe. Finally, for comparison to our 2010 analysis, we calculated the amount of plastic waste generated by coastal populations in the 50 countries that generated the highest amounts of plastic waste in 2016. For the other countries besides the US, we used the same methodologies in the JAMBEC study, but with updated data from the World Bank. And what we found was that between 500,000 and 1.5 million metric tons of plastic waste generated in the US ended up in coastal environments in 2016. And when we look at that new global ranking, that means the US ranks as high as third by the upper bound estimate in contributions of mismanaged plastic waste to the coastal environment. So we are facing a global crisis of rapidly increasing amounts of plastic waste, far too much of which ends up in our soils, our waterways, and the ocean. So is plastic pollution a waste problem? Certainly, yes. It's not only a waste problem, as I've discussed a little bit earlier in terms of some of these other sources, but it is certainly a waste problem. And what has become clear, especially in light of the current pandemic, is that we absolutely rely on plastics in our daily lives, and it's unrealistic to think that we can ban their use entirely. However, we must do what we can to reduce the amount of waste we produce, especially in countries such as the US that generate some of the highest amounts of plastic waste in the world. And we must assume full responsibility for its reprocessing and its ultimate disposal to reduce the waste contaminating our environment. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on the work specifically presented in this talk. The NC's Marine Debris Working Group was funded by the National Science Foundation and Ocean Conservancy, and the US Plastic Waste Study was funded by Ocean Conservancy and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. And the authors here are for both of those studies. Thank you.